Welcome to this hub event. A very exciting speaker, in fact, a colleague and a very close friend for 20 years now, over 20 years now. We met when we were 5, if you're wondering. But Gita Johar. So Professor Gita Johar, she's a Meyer Feldberg Professor of Business here at Columbia Business School. She served in multiple roles in the school, in the dean's office as a senior vice dean for DEI. Very accomplished researcher, won multiple awards for her research, dozens of papers, and you'll hear about some of her papers today during today's session. And one of the really things that I really like about Gita's work is that she takes topics that are very timely and technology topics like information and misinformation, but looks at them not necessarily from the computer science perspective or the information system, but rather from the psychology of them, right? Both the psychology of those who generate that information and psychology of those who are consuming that information. And I think that's the topic for today, right? So thank you, Gita, for leading this hub event.
Thank you, Oded. Thanks everyone for coming, and now I've got to live up to this build-up, so I'll do my best. So as Oded mentioned, I do research. Lately, I've been doing a lot of research on misinformation, and this definitely since 2016, but it's really a long-standing interest of mine. Going back many years, I've been interested in topics like deceptive advertising, how do you correct for false beliefs. So I'm a marketing professor, so that's kind of the start of my interest. But of course, today, this is much more widespread. We're not just talking about deceptive advertising, we're talking about this whole class of misinformation. So jumping ahead, let me tell you what I want to do today. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to try to define what is misinformation. This is a very fraught topic, so I'm going to give you my perspective on the topic and then open it up for questions at the end. So I'll talk about the definition, why it's important, what are the risks of misinformation, challenges in addressing it, particularly from a psychological perspective. And then I want to talk briefly on the EU approach to combating misinformation versus the US approach. And I think both of these rely on fundamentally different philosophies on human processing of information and human behavior. So after that, I want to present a paper that I'm currently working on, which seeks to find out what types of people share misinformation. And the point is, if we can kind of identify that, we can actually try to prevent misinformation from entering the public sphere. So that's kind of a quick roadmap. Let me jump into a definition. So you can think about misinformation as false information. A lot of people go beyond that and think about intent. Is it something that people intentionally share? But very simply put, I like this definition, that misinformation refers to a claim that contradicts or distorts verifiable facts. So here there's something very important. We're talking about facts. We're not talking about opinion. We're not talking about people's thoughts. We're just talking about verifiable facts. So people talk about misinformation and fake news in the same breath. Fake news is something that's usually put out by content creators, so publishers. So you can think about, for example, Robert Kennedy puts out a lot of information that's anti-vaccine. So he is a publisher of this kind of information, and that's referred to as fake news because the scientific consensus doesn't align with the kind of information that he is putting out. Platforms, of course, are the social media platforms that we all know and love or love to hate. And then also the people like us who share this information. And that's why it's really important to think about misinformation, because it doesn't just live for a minute and live online, but it spreads and all of us are exposed to it. So again, these 3 Ps I think are really important to keep in mind: the publishers or creators of misinformation, the platforms that carry this misinformation, and then the people who share the misinformation. So it's been around for a long time. We thought about misinformation often as propaganda. So, like wartime leaflets dropping down, we know that from hundreds of years. So that's propaganda. But misinformation is particularly relevant today because of the advent of the social platforms. And what happens in social platforms is that it's very easy to share misinformation. So there's no friction, if you will. You're online, you see a piece of information, it looks interesting to you, and you just hit share, and there it is, going to your entire network. And so this information spreads really, really quickly. And misinformation, by its very nature, tends to be novel, exciting, interesting, and so on. And therefore, people tend to engage with it more, meaning they tend to click on that misinformation, they tend to like or share, and so on. They react to this misinformation. So this greater engagement is kind of a double problem. Firstly, the greater engagement leads to it being shared more by people, but also the algorithms pick up this greater engagement, and as a result, these pieces of information, that is misinformation, get prioritized by the algorithms and show up, on the top of your social media feeds. So that's another problem with social media, the fact that these algorithms are working to actually propagate this kind of content. And then I would also say that people don't really tend to fact check on social media. So this is a paper that I wrote a few years ago with a couple of doctoral students here, Yu Jungjun and Rachel Meng, who have graduated since then. But this was in 2017, where we show that people tend to fact check even less on social media than they would in other contexts. And that's because they feel kind of safe, they feel in the presence of others, and therefore they reduce their vigilance and they tend to fact check less. So, so this is one more reason why it's particularly important to think about misinformation in the age of social media. So people aren't fact checking, they're sharing, they're engaging more, and the algorithms are picking that up. In terms of to put a number on this, there was a paper that showed that false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories. So in many ways, this is clearly, important to study, because in this age of social media, just to summarize, misinformation has taken on a life of its own. So what are the risks? So we've said it's really important to study what are the risks of misinformation, and I don't think I have to belabor this point. I think we are living in an age where it's pretty obvious what the risks of misinformation are. So I put some examples up here. We know about COVID vaccines, and misinformation led to hesitancy to take the vaccines. We know about the 2020 US elections and the insurrection, which is an outgrowth, again, of misinformation. And climate change. A lot of people are kind of reluctant to take action, or to even ask legislators to take action against climate change because of a lot of misinformation about climate change and about the human causes of climate change. We are seeing it today as well with the Middle East war, where there's a lot of misinformation that's being spread both in the form of text, in the form of pictures, and in the form of videos. So I've talked about people sharing misinformation, but we also know today what's really important is generative AI, and we've read and seen a lot of the fact that generative AI can create misinformation. And this is something that people are becoming aware of. And there are all these services that will put a stamp on something telling you it's being created by generative AI or not. But all of these things are in their infancy, and the fact remains that generative AI can create a lot of misinformation, and this is going to spread as well. Now, there's, again, two parts of this that worry me. One is that the generative AI can create this misinformation, but the other is the fact that people understand that generative AI can create this misinformation, and as a result, they begin to mistrust all information. So in a world where I don't know if this is created by humans, I don't know if it's true or false, I don't know if it's created by generative AI, the rational thing for me to do might be to say, you know what, I'm not going to trust anything. I'm not going to trust any information. And this is clearly problematic, because a lack of trust is really kind of the start of breakdown of society. So you really do need trust, and I think generative AI is kind of undermining trust in information. So to summarize the risks, just the existence of misinformation poses a severe threat to society, and we've seen many examples of that. So, you know, it's important, it's risky. You would think after all these years we have some answers, but unfortunately it's really difficult. It's a very, very hard problem to solve misinformation, or to solve the spread of misinformation. So I put some questions up here, because when I talk about misinformation or truth or false information and so on, people always ask, how do we know, right? How do you know what is true and what is false? And who gets to decide what is true and what is false? And is kind of preventing misinformation from getting into the public sphere, is that censorship? Like, where do we draw these lines? So also the role of the US government. Should the government be involved in trying to combat misinformation? And some people might say, well, that's not really the role of government. And in fact, a judge recently ruled that the Biden administration was overstepping by talking to platforms about COVID misinformation. I think that's since been overturned, and there's still another judge looking at the case. But the fact remains that some people believe the government shouldn't intercede to address misinformation. So that's a huge problem. Let me tell you the legal background. In the US, the legal background says that platforms are not liable for any information that they carry. In other words, platforms are not publishers. They're only carrying the information, and therefore they're not liable for any content posted on their sites. Okay? So this has led, as you can imagine, platforms off to kind of, you know, just ignore this problem. Maybe some of them try to address it. They have fact checkers, but the way they address it is a very, very small drop in the ocean. So they're trying to address a huge problem with a very small kind of drop in the ocean. So publishers in the US, meaning because they're not publishers, these platforms are let off the hook. Okay? So if you ever wonder why, you know, your TikTok or your Instagram or your Facebook is full of things you know to be false, it's because they don't care to regulate it, because they are not held liable. Let's look at the EU on the other hand. So the EU recently passed the Digital Services Act. And the Digital Services Act is specifically meant to foster safer online spaces. And any large platform, anything that has more than 45 million users, so most of the things we are familiar with, most such platforms will be held liable by the EU if they are shown to actually have misinformation on their platforms. Now, these are early days. The law was recently passed, and I think the first stage in this was these platforms had to submit self-audits of how they aim to kind of address this law. And so it's still early days, but I think there are very sharp and clear penalties that the EU has put. You know, this law has teeth. And what they're saying is if these platforms continue to spread misinformation, they're liable for up to 6% of their global revenues in fines. And I haven't put a number there, but as you can imagine, this is a huge number in the billions, right? 6% of global revenues. So how they're going to do it is a big problem, right? So I think one of the approaches I'll talk about soon is maybe one way in which social platforms can try to address the spirit of the EU law. So when you think about the US law and the EU law, it's really a difference in philosophies. So in the US, I think the idea is that all information should be out there, right? We don't want to prevent any information from being out there. And people should be free to make their minds up and pass the content and decide what is true and what is false. And in the end, in this marketplace of ideas, the truth will prevail, right? So one can think of that kind of a philosophy. And then the opposite philosophy should be something like the EU's philosophy, is that people should only be exposed to information that's objectively true. Again, we can debate what that means. And information considered false should not enter the public sphere. So if you think about the second one, the EU approach, I think it raises some questions. Again, questions I've talked about, like what is truth, who decides, and what is true today may be untrue tomorrow. So this is the biggest issue, I think, often when people think about misinformation, because we can all cite examples of something we thought of as misinformation today that actually turned out to be true later on. Whether it's in the context of COVID or anything else, there are examples about whether COVID was spread by the particles in the air, whether masks are good for COVID. Truth is not a fixed thing. Truth can change over time. So I think that is clearly something that we have to acknowledge in this debate. So to me, whether we go with this EU point of view or the US point of view depends on what we prioritize. Like, do we prioritize preventing information that is today considered false, maybe true tomorrow, but is today considered false, from entering the public sphere? Or do we acknowledge that information may be true or false, and we want it to be in the public sphere, expecting that people, humans, will actually do the work of sorting out what is true and what is false as that evolves over time? So I think there's a different weight that you put on these two things, whether you prefer to prevent misinformation from getting out, or you prefer not to prevent, sorry, that's a mouthful, prefer not to prevent true information from getting out. So those are two different approaches. And to me, so this is where I come down, and this is based on research in consumer psychology. And to me, it's really difficult to expect human beings to do that work of parsing out what is true and what is false. So my take is very consistent with the EU kind of take, which is that it's critical to prevent misinformation from getting out, fully acknowledging that what is misinformation today may not always be misinformation. But it is critical, and there are three reasons why I say that you need to prevent misinformation from getting out. The first one is that people tend to share and spread information regardless of whether it's true. I mean, we've all been tempted to do that. We see something really funny, really interesting, and we just we share it with our friends. And there's a lot of research in psychology that says that people tend to share information regardless of whether it's true or false. If you ask people, most of them say, you know what, I really only want to share true things. I don't want to share false things. But that's not what the behavior is actually. And that's because we are not always very careful. We have constraints on our capacity. We don't have the ability to really think through everything that comes our way. So even though we want to share only true things, we end up sharing all kinds of things. There are also other reasons that people in the psychological literature have identified for why people share misinformation, even though they really don't want to do that. This includes things like impression management. You want to make other people think highly of you, and so you think if you're the first to share something, that's the way to get attention. It could be that it's a coping mechanism. In fact, in some work I've done, we do find that people shared a lot of information on COVID as a coping mechanism, as a way to kind of make meaning of their lives. There's also other reasons, like practical reasons, to find out from your network, is this really true or false? So you might share it for that reason. So people tend to share information and it spreads regardless of whether it's true or false, which is one reason why I think it's important to prevent misinformation from getting into the public sphere. The second reason is, okay, so you share it. You might assume people are going to be able to tell whether it's true or false, but we all know that we are very driven by our ideological biases. So people are very prone to think of any information they see as true. They tend to think, if they've seen it a few times, they tend to process it really easily, and they think it's even more true. So the more you're exposed to information, the more likely you are to believe it. That's the fluency heuristic. And you also tend to try to extract information from content, and often you will extract information in a way that aligns with your prior beliefs. So for example, political ideology, conservatives and liberals can see the same piece of information but may interpret them in very different ways, and may also choose to believe or disbelieve information that's more consistent with their own prior beliefs. So this is a second reason why I think it's critical to prevent misinformation from getting out. And then the third reason is that let's assume it's out there and people are sharing it without thinking about the truth. You know, people are processing it in a biased way. You might think, okay, but we should be able to correct that, correct those false beliefs. And again, the literature shows that it's really, really difficult to correct false beliefs. So if you debunk, so for example, if there's information out there and you put a label saying this is fact-checked and it's false, or its information is flagged as being kind of unverifiable, by that point in time, you've already processed the initial information. And what the research shows is that it's very difficult to get people to update their beliefs, even if you put out a correction. So there are all these findings in the literature. And an interesting one, actually, which is counterintuitive, is that these corrections could actually backfire, in the sense that because you're showing people the original misinformation again and then saying this is false, you might actually be reinforcing the original view rather than correcting that original view. So that's one of the problems. And then I've seen statistics about low trust in fact checkers. So if you try to correct and you say this is by an independent third-party fact checker like Snopes or PolitiFact or something like that, what you might find is people don't trust you. So 70% of Republicans actually don't trust fact checks. Okay? So in this world, fact checking is not going to work, debunking is not going to work if people don't trust the debunker. So again, for those three reasons, I think it's really critical to prevent misinformation, or let's call it information that's currently classified as misinformation, because that could change, from getting into the public sphere. And that's what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about, is how do we do this? Like, how do we prevent misinformation from getting into the public sphere? And there are a few problems with doing this, right? The first is, how do you classify information as true or misinformation? And there's fact checkers, as I alluded to before, but they're very, very limited. So you have a few fact checkers. And so what really needs to happen to prevent misinformation from getting into the public sphere is that you need to scale up this fact-checking ecosystem. And that's work that I'm doing with another doctoral student who graduated last year, Yu Ding. And what we are trying to see is how can you involve the crowd, like people like us, in the fact-checking ecosystem in a way that is valid, because we are all also biased by our ideologies and so on. So how do we do that in a way that's biased? How now, today we can ask, can you leverage generative AI, machine learning, and other tools to actually scale up the fact-checking ecosystem? Because that's necessary if you're going to prevent misinformation from getting into the public sphere. The other way you can prevent misinformation from getting into the public sphere is thinking about who's doing this, who's creating and who's spreading this misinformation. And for the rest of the talk today, that's what I want to focus on. Kevin, how much time do I have?
About 15 minutes.
Oh, good. OK. OK, so how do we prevent misinformation from getting out? This is some of the past research, which has basically, in computer science, has looked at information. As I said, you know, misinformation tends to be novel, tends to be surprising, tends to be funny, exciting, all those things. And that's what computer science research has done. They have identified the semantic markers of misinformation itself. And our approach is going to be a little different. Coming from marketing, we think of, you know, segmentation and targeting and so on. So we're thinking about who are these people that spread fake news, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. Who shares misinformation and why? And the implications of this, just to cut to the chase, if we can do this well, if we can identify who shares misinformation and why, we can actually prioritize their posts for fact-checking in real time. So we are not saying we want to censor them, deplatform them, or any such thing. So no drastic solutions, but just saying if we can identify these people, perhaps we can prioritize what they're posting for fact-checking before it is actually out there to the visible to the public. That, again, presumes that you have that fact-checking system in place. But let's assume that's the case. Then you can prioritize their posts for fact-checking. We can also, once we understand who's sharing and why, we can come up with interventions that we could use online to actually reduce sharing of misinformation. So again, to cut to the chase, we find that people who share misinformation tend to be angry and anxious and desire power. So for example, you could think of online interventions that reduce anger and anxiety and increase feelings of power. Maybe there are very simple cues in the environment online that can have these kinds of effects. So this is a paper that I'm working on, and I'm going to go fairly quickly in the interest of time, but I think the intuition of this is, I hope, pretty clear at this point. We are going to identify who shares fake news, and we're going to do this on Twitter, and this is with two co-authors, Verena Schoenmüller, who's at ESADE in Barcelona, and Simon Blanchard, who's at Georgetown. They were both here at Columbia 7 years ago when we started this project. So, and this is still under review, hopefully coming out soon. Okay, so this is kind of the structure, and I'm going to really go quickly, but to give you a little bit of the flavor of the next few minutes, I'll start giving you some literature background on this topic, on who shares fake news, what's been found so far. Then the way we're going to approach this is we're going to scrape all the tweets of people who we say, we have a mechanism to say, okay, these are people who've shared fake news in the past. I'm going to extract all of their tweets and try to understand through their language in their tweets, all their tweets, not just the tweets where they share fake news, but all their tweets. I'm going to try to understand through their language what kinds of people share fake news. And then I'm going to see whether adding these psycholinguistic cues from that language can help us predict better than just simply using what past research has used, which is socio-demographics to the mostly, and see if we can improve prediction of who shares fake news. And then if we have time, I'll get into some potential interventions that can reduce the sharing of fake news. Okay, so this is kind of what we do. We have a person who has a Twitter account. We get all of their tweets, and we augment their data, which they have either on their profile page, or we infer some of these data. I won't get into the details of how we do that. And then we use the language as well and infer emotions, their emotional states, and so on. Can you hold till the, okay. And then we have a prediction of what's their likelihood to share fake news. So that's kind of the whole story. This is what we know so far. I'll go through it very quickly. So we just, basically, past research says it's older white men who are conservative who share fake news. But this is a real problem, because in the 2020 elections, for example, it's really the supply side could be the reason why people said that, or 2016 for that matter, because the fake news tended to be pro-conservative, and meaning it either denigrated the other side or it propped up the conservative side. As a result, people who were sharing this information tended to be conservative because it was aligned with their ideological motives. So can one say, therefore, that all misinformation is always likely to be shared by conservatives? Probably not, right? Like, all we know is for that kind of misinformation. And we're going to, okay, so we're going to not just kind of go beyond this simplistic idea of who shares fake news, but we're also going to go beyond it in a way of thinking about control groups, because most of the past research says, okay, compared to like random Twitter users, misinformation sharers or fake news sharers tend to be older, conservative, and so on. But I think there are lots of other players in this ecosystem. There's people who share fact checks. A lot of us and a lot of our friends are also busy trying to combat fake news by sharing fact checks. So there's the fact check sharer. There are people who read right-leaning news media and share articles from right-leaning news media that may not be misinformation. Similarly for the left-leaning news media. So we have many different control conditions compared to past literature to really try to uniquely identify who shares misinformation compared to these other groups. We're going to be looking at emotions, and we're going to be looking at personality. And this is what we expect. And again, to foreshadow, this is pretty much what we find, is that people are angry and anxious. As I said, that's a trait level thing. They tend to be anxious and angry people who share fake news. Their language makes a lot of reference to death and religion, and they mention a lot of power-related words. So just to show you some results, actually, I'll very quickly tell you, we look at both political and non-political fake news, which I think is also very interesting because they are very different, but we find a consistent pattern in our results regardless. We also try to, so this is non-political fake news. CIA agent confesses that he killed Bob Marley. And then here's political fake news. Did Joe Biden fall down the stairs of Air Force One again? And okay, I'm going to skip by this just in the interest of time. So what we do is that we classify people as fake news sharers. We have these two data sets. Let me just go back there. Yeah, so we classify people as fake news sharers if they've shared a new piece of information in the past, let's say in 2016, that was classified by Snopes as fake news. And we extract all their tweets. Or we classify people as fake news sharers in another data set if they've shared news from dubious news sources. Okay? So that's how we know, like, okay, in the past you've done this, so we're going to call you, for the sake of this paper, a fake news sharer, and then we're going to try to profile you by looking at all your tweets. So that's kind of what we do, and I'm going to just go ahead and show you some results. Okay, I'm going to skip by, sorry. Let me show you some results. So what you see here is just fake news sharers identified the way I said. They had shared some fake news in the past. And we kind of do a lot of tests and robustness tests to make sure that is indeed a fake news sharer. So just take my word for it for now, that we have a good handle on who these people are. And we find that they tend to be really more angry and anxious than a sample of social media users who are matched to them on everything else in terms of their demographics, in terms of their social media usage, and so on. So there's a matched group of users, and our fake news sharers tend to be more angry and more anxious than them. They also tend to be use more power-related words. Now here's a question for the audience. What do you think about fact-check sharers? Do you think they're also angry and anxious, as angry and anxious as fake news sharers, or less? More? Same. Same? Okay, do most people think same? Yeah? Okay, I think your intuition is spot on. So fact check, actually, we didn't think that going in. We actually assumed that fake news sharers are going to be more angry and anxious than fact check sharers. But when you reflect on it, I mean, your intuition is exactly right, that these people are also, you know, really upset about what's going on, and they want to like be on top of the news and share fact checks. So they are as angry and anxious. So in the past, if you didn't look at fact check sharers, you might end up misclassifying fact check sharers, those are the good people, as fake news sharers. And I think what we do in our research is really try to differentiate those two groups. And then death and religion, that's what differentiates fake news sharers from fact check sharers, and power does as well. They do that more than all the other groups. And then personality is actually not that differentiating, so I won't get into that. The same results I showed you actually replicate in that second data set. And here again, we are comparing to right media sharers or left media sharers. That's non-fake news, but that's right-leaning or left-leaning. And we again find that the fake news sharers are more angry, more anxious than these people who are sharing right and left news. Okay. So those results basically replicate the results from the other sample. And overall, we feel we have a handle in terms of the emotions of fake news sharers. And I'll just kind of, without going through the slides in the interest of time, do we have 5 minutes? 5, okay. I'll just tell you what we find here, and maybe I'll show you one graph. So what we do is we try to predict who is a fake news sharer in a model, right? So normally you would put in like age, gender, maybe political ideology, where they live, and all these things into a model, which is the basic baseline model that you see here: demographics, political affiliation, social media behavior, and so on. And to that model, we add what we get from our text mining exercise, which is all this emotions and personality and all these other things. And what we are showing here is that we can predict better, more accurately, whether somebody is a fake news sharer or not when we add all of these additional pieces of information. It may look like it's not a lot, but it's actually pretty meaningful. And also, we are able to differentiate in a way that we minimize both type 1 and type 2 errors, so that we're not misclassifying in either way. So that's that. And then I think what was really an interesting exercise that we were pushed to do as this paper has been going through review, academic review, is that this is 2016, 2017. How do we know that these people are the same people today that are actually sharing, that the profile has not changed? So what we did is we created a new sample of people who share fake news in 2022 and tried to predict using the same model that we had in the past. And we actually do find that we are able to increase the predictability of who shares fake news today using that model from 2017. OK, so that's kind of a high-level summary of what we did so far. We kind of find the psycholinguistic cues from language can help us predict who's a fake news sharer. And what we also did, which I don't have time to get into, is that we use like power words on people's Twitter timelines and show that those power words empowering people can actually make them more willing to do things such as downloading a fact-checking software because they feel empowered. We use words like take control, like feel, we use words related to power and in the ad for a fact check browser extension, and we find that helps them do that. And also we find reducing anger can reduce the motivation to share surprising fake news. So I think overall these findings are very helpful in trying to say if we want to prevent the sharing of misinformation, we can try to profile who these people are and try to fact check them in real time. I know this opens up a huge can of worms, and I know, and I'm anticipating many questions about, isn't this really problematic? And I would say, yes, I'm not saying this is a fantastic and great solution, but it seems like we need a solution, and it really depends on what we prioritize. Do we prioritize, as I would argue from a human psychology perspective, do we prioritize preventing any information that could be potentially false from getting out into the public sphere? And so that's why I come down on this type of solution. We have access to 3,200 tweets. X has access to your lifetime of tweets. They can tweak these models, make them better. So what we're offering is an approach given the limited data that we have at our disposal. But people that, if they're serious, platforms can actually do this and do this much better and really be able to prioritize people for fact checking. And OK, I'll stop there. Thank you. I think there was a question. Yeah.
Could you give us an example of the psycholinguistic cues that help you identify
yeah.
text?
Sure. So there's this Luke. It's a dictionary, language-based dictionary, where they actually have identified words and how these words map onto different emotions, for example. So there's like 25 words, and if you use those words, those would get your language classified as having some percent, the percent of words of angry words. So that's a dictionary-based approach. So there is Pennebaker, he's a psychologist that created this dictionary of all these words and what kind of emotions and cognitive processes and other things they tap onto.
I guess my question is, would you expect the results to be replicated across like other social media platforms? Because Twitter makes sense to me, like the content is very news-like, but something like Instagram or TikTok, like you mentioned, with a different user base.
Yeah, I think it's an empirical question. It's a great question. So we just have Twitter, and I think what we have is it's political and non-political, but we don't have as much insight into either the kinds of people. Maybe like TikTok is much younger users, for example, and maybe there are different motivations for why people share news there versus Twitter. So I wouldn't say it's generalizable across platforms, but again, I think it's an approach you can use in different platforms. Yeah. I think there's a question there, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. The libel laws within this country set a pretty high bar, but they have been shown to be effective, right? With the Fox News lawsuit recently. Do you feel like that's another effective approach to maybe stopping a lot of misinformation at the source, rather than when it's too late and it's kind of trickled out to a wider audience already? Yeah,
great point. Are you talking about the Dominion case?
It was the Dominion.
Yeah, but that was also after the fact, though, right? I mean,
that was after the fact. But I think the idea is that to show, because it's such a high bar, it was rarely used. But now that it's shown to be effective, they are starting to use that in a much wider.
Yeah, I mean, if there's appetite to do that, that would be great. I think my only view is that we need to do prevention. We can't be doing after-the-fact correction. Yeah. Yes?
most of this done for primary publishers or like secondary? So like people retweeting or?
You mean who did we profile? It's retweeting. So it's not content creators. It's people who are sharing.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just curious how the platforms, like the social media platforms, get into this as well, because there's also, I guess, kind of an algorithms, a prioritization of sensationalized information. So I'm just wondering how that plays into perpetuating misinformation and just that being skewed to being more popular online.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're saying is there's this whole movement also that's called detoxifying the algorithm, which is another approach, which is let's not prioritize all the sensational news, which tends to be misinformation. So that's something that a lot of nonprofit organizations and others have talked about, exactly what you're saying, like detoxifying the algorithm. Yeah, it's a good approach as well. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that when you give people the power words that might lead them to download the fact checking, is that also the people who do the misleading, or is the goal for everyone to be better at that, or is it to arm the people who are receiving it?
Yeah, that is a really fantastic point. So without getting into details, we did think that those who our model identifies as more likely to share fake news will be more affected by the intervention of using power words, but we actually don't find that. We find that everyone is more likely to download the fact checker, whether you're a high or a low. And I mean, actually, this is one of those things where it's a good thing overall. So, I mean, I'm fine with that result. I think one thing I didn't get into very much, and your question just made me think about it, is this question of intent. Because in our approach, intent doesn't matter, because we're just saying, like, you know, if you've shared fake news and we're going to call you a fake news sharer, and then we're going to be trying to see your profile and all that. I didn't really look at whether they intentionally shared or unintentionally shared. And that's a difference between disinformation and misinformation. So disinformation is when it is intentionally shared. Most misinformation tends to be shared unintentionally. But again, coming back to the perspective that we don't want it in the public sphere, to me, I'm agnostic about whether it is intentional or non-intentional. But it's a debate one can have for sure. Is it like punitive to kind of target people who are unintentionally sharing misinformation? But in my view, the targeting is not punitive if you're not really doing much more than just slowing down the posting of their tweets. So it really depends what is the cost of implementing the solution. Yeah.
I mean, with these classifications, right, I mean, whether it's power or, are we really classifying people, or are we classifying their tweets? Meaning, are these the characteristics of misinformed, which may explain why the two groups look the same, because fact checkers often talk about the same ones, just saying these are wrong, right?
But the language we are scraping is not just when they're sharing fact checks or fake news. It's their language. In fact, less than 10% of their tweets are actually doing this kind of thing. So the language we're scraping is all their language.
Yeah, but I'm saying, is it more that it tends to be influenced by that or similar to that, even when it's true? And I guess the question then becomes, should we worry about people or should we worry about posts? Meaning, why shouldn't we just do the same thing you did, which is looking at the text and identifying what tweets are the misinformed as opposed to which people are?
But then that's too late, right? Because if you're going to be looking at the language of tweets, then it's after it's out there. Whereas what I'm trying to say is let's prevent that misinformation from getting out.
What I'm saying is you're going to now take the tweets of these people and send it to fact check, right?
Before they post them, yeah. So but your approach would be like, which tweets should I take? Should I take all tweets? Or I guess you're saying that first I would do a text mining.
If I identifying, given exactly the tools you said, which tweets are likely to, then I'll send these tweets as opposed to the people themselves.
But I mean, that's a it's a good question. And I think one would need to see which approach is better at like filtering out, right? Like I haven't done that. But that's a good question. Like, why not use the language, do some kind of background check on each post, and then take the ones that have maybe angry and anxious words and send them for fact checking.
So you use the punity, whatever that is, at the tweet level as opposed to at the person level.
And I don't know which one would be more efficient and effective, but that's a good question. Yeah.
is there any research on secondary, like after the fact learning? So like, let's say in a systemic way, misinformation or like information we find out is false, and then people are already accustomed to that truth. Is there any research that like shows how you can make people accept the new learning?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research looking at it, but the bottom line is it's very difficult to get people to update and to learn, especially given that we all live in these ideological bubbles and we don't want to entertain anything that's different from what we choose to believe or want to believe. But I think to answer your question, what I think is the best approach is people talk about inoculation, right? Like before the fact, like with vaccines, you inoculate people by giving them a small dose of the virus so that they are then resistant to the big dose of the virus. So a lot of people talk about inoculation as being one potential. So instead of combating one piece of misinformation at a time, you inoculate people about misinformation in a realm, let's say climate change or COVID, and then they're able to then be more attentive when they're processing information. So that inoculation could work, but even better is what I think Finland does really well, which is they're the country that's the most resilient to misinformation in some surveys that have been done. And what they do is they teach preschoolers to kind of differentiate information like fact from opinion and so on. So this kind of media literacy starts very early in countries like Finland, which I think is one way to really maybe another way to kind of address this problem. Yeah.
You mentioned that the anger anxious, right, is related, but then also when you decreased anger, that there was.
Yeah, so when we decreased anger, what?
How that was.
Sure. Yeah, so in psychology, there are many approaches. So a lot of the approaches we use draw on the psychological literature and may not be able to be implemented at scale. So, but what we want to show is that this is a process that can be changed. So what we did is we made people think about a moment in their lives when they were really angry. So we increased anger and we made them write about it. So that increased anger. And then we reduced anger in half those people by saying, now think about talking to a friend about what you just wrote, what would you tell them? So it's a little like a coping strategy, and that reduces their anger. So that's how we created the two groups. And what we find is that if your anger is reduced, then you have less motivation to share surprising news and therefore share less misinformation.
Right, so yeah. Thank you, Gita, for a wonderful and a very interesting event.